You may be wondering why three academic philosophers, are here talking to you at a Bitcoin conference. The short version is that, well, we wrote a Bitcoin book, and the conference organizers told us not to talk about the Bitcoin book. Now, we're going to talk about it a little bit. Not yet, but in a little bit. But first, I want to tell you about a problem. The problem, I'm afraid, is academics and the wrong and even damaging things they say about Bitcoin. I'll give you two examples. And if you went to Daniel Batten's talk yesterday, you know of some others. There's a paper by some professors at a business school at New York University. It's about whether Bitcoin can scale. And the argument is that it can't. And it goes like this. Well, if there's more transactions, then miners will hash faster and faster. And if miners hash faster and faster, then of course blocks will arrive faster and faster. Too fast for the network to keep up. Now, I'm seeing some confused looks out there, because you know probably what's wrong with the argument already. We could sum it up with just two words. Difficulty, adjustment. Difficulty, adjustment. Now, what is wild to me, what's wild to us, is that these professors didn't know about the difficulty adjustment. And so they said not just wrong, but shameful things about Bitcoin. It gets worse. There's another paper you may have heard of before, called by Bitcoiners, Mora et al. Any of you read it? Somebody here has read it. Lovely. You are doing better than 99.9% of the scientific community that comments on and cites this paper, because most people who cite the paper, and there have been many, haven't actually read it. And I can tell you why, how I know that they haven't actually read it. First, the main argument of the paper results in a chart that shows emissions resulting from Bitcoin mining going up like this. Now, this chart was released 5 years ago. We have 5 years of data now showing that emissions did not go up like this. And yet the paper continues to be cited. Furthermore, there's a unit error in the chart. They're talking about gigatons instead of what should have been megatons. And this error to this day remains uncorrected. That tells me that very few people have actually looked at the chart and compared it to reality. So far, what I've said is this. Academics have been wrong about Bitcoin. But nobody reads this stuff, right? Right?
Unfortunately, some people do. And those people are journalists. Journalists have a hard job. They have to write multiple articles at a time on a deadline, and they simply don't have time to become subject matter experts in all of the things that they're writing about. And so they have to outsource the expertise to others. And who other to outsource the expertise to than academics, people who work at nonprofit institutions, who've been vetted by their own scholarly community. And so the journalists read these academic papers, and then they translate them into normal, everyday parlance. And the problem is that when you start with crap, you end up getting crap. And you can see from these headlines some of the crap that has ended up in some of the most prestigious newspapers, at least in the US. We've got some from the New York Times and some from the Washington Post. And like the academic papers, these papers get some things wrong. So they do say some controversial things that you might disagree with, but aren't obviously wrong. For example, they say that Bitcoin's not suited for payments because it's too expensive to transact on chain. But they don't know that you can build layers on top of Bitcoin to make payments, and that those layers come very cheaply. So maybe that's okay. They say that Bitcoin is used for illicit activities. But they don't say that, according to some data from Chainalysis, about $2.4 billion a year worth of Bitcoin is used for illicit payments, compared to the $2 to $3 trillion dollars of government-backed currencies. But maybe we could set that aside. They also say that Bitcoin has been hacked, and that we just can't let go. The article on the top left, Bitcoin Cosplay is Getting Real, says that the US government took funds back from some people that had stolen them by cracking Bitcoin, by hacking the passwords. And that just simply hasn't happened. SHA-256 encryption, ECDSA have not been hacked. That's just flat out wrong. But when you're trying to write a lot of things really quickly, you skip over some of the details. And that leaves the public, unfortunately, with an impression that just isn't true. If the public, that is reading these kinds of things. But, I mean, newspapers, that's kind of old technology. Are people still reading newspapers?
I have some bad news, Bradley. So, policymakers and regulators don't have time to read these academic papers, so they read the journalism. And this has resulted, unfortunately, in some attacks on Bitcoin mining, self-custody, and financial privacy. So take the Bitcoin mining front, where policymakers and regulators are largely concerned, and falsely concerned, that Bitcoin mining contributes disproportionately to global carbon emissions. As a result, we've seen legislation proposed by the ministers of energy and digitization in Norway to effectively ban Bitcoin mining in the country. We've seen similar, though less draconian, legislation proposed in the United States, and especially in Sweden, to tax the Bitcoin mining industry out of existence. Or take the self-custody and financial privacy front. Here, lawmakers are concerned, and falsely again, that Bitcoin is the vehicle of choice for terrorist financing. And so we've seen people like the US Senator Elizabeth Warren propose anti-money laundering legislation that would make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to self-custody Bitcoin. We've seen similar, though less draconian legislation already passed by the European Parliament. And what concerns me most, and what should concern all of us, is the attack on software developers who are working on technologies that promote financial privacy. So here I'm thinking in particular of the Samurai wallet developers in the United States who are facing serious jail time, but also the Ethereum developers behind Tornado Cash, one of whom is in jail right now, serving a 5-year sentence just 100 kilometers up the road. So these are serious issues. The problem has bled all the way through to journalism and to policymaking and law enforcement and regulators. And bad research on Bitcoin in academia is largely to blame, and so is the absence of good research. So, Andrew, I was thinking about what you might be able to say about how, first, academia has worked against Bitcoin for several years, and how maybe now it's time for academia to work for Bitcoin.
The time is now. We've started the fight here with our own book, Resistance Money. I'll tell you a little bit about that, and then we'll turn to the next stages in the campaign to make academia work for rather than against Bitcoin. There are a lot of Bitcoin books. Resistance Money is different. We wanted to write something first that was comprehensive, not just looking at Bitcoin from one angle, for example, from monetary policy, or just from censorship resistance, or just from financial inclusion, but to look at it from every possible angle. That means being interdisciplinary, which is a fancy word of saying looking at it from every possible angle. A problem that we faced when thinking about Bitcoin, and you're probably familiar with this problem, is that our biases conspire to keep us from thinking clearly. It's easy to replace the question, is Bitcoin good, with the question, is Bitcoin good for me? And then that becomes the question, well, do I have some, and will it pump? Or am I short Bitcoin, and will it dump? But that's not a very intellectually serious or responsible way of evaluating a new technology and figuring out, is this actually good for the world? So we've proposed a framing device or a thought experiment to help us overcome some of those biases and think about these issues a little bit more seriously. It goes, in brief, like this. You fall asleep, and suppose that when you wake up, you could turn out to be anyone. Any one of 8 billion people alive today. You could be a Venezuelan farmer. You could be a human rights activist. You could be Michael Saylor. You could be Brad. You could be anyone. Now, from that neutral perspective, holding everything you know about the world in your head, but not knowing who you are, would you want to wake up in a world with Bitcoin or without? The nice thing about this thought experiment is that it helps us strip away our own interests and think about Bitcoin from a more general or neutral perspective. The book develops this perspective and then applies it across a variety of dimensions, thinking about both the philosophical as well as the empirical facts that bear on this. Now, one book isn't going to change academia. That's just one little battle. This is not about the battle. This is about the war. And in a war, you need a campaign. So let's think about what that campaign might look like, not just waged by these 3 guys on the stage, but by all our friends and all the other academics who are really trying to think about Bitcoin seriously to tell the truth about it. What's the first stage of the campaign, and how might this unfold?
Stage 1 is cleaning up the crap. These papers that have made false claims about Bitcoin, that have failed to account for the difficulty adjustment and things like that, are still out in the literature. They're still being cited. And they've received some responses here or there, but not enough. We're not talking now about negative articles about Bitcoin. Those are fine, as long as they are undertaken with the right scholarly methods and sensitive to the truth. It's the ones that make mistakes, that get things wrong, that need to be corrected. Stage 2 is to rebuild, to do the research ourselves. So in July, I announced at Bitcoin Nashville the creation of the University of Wyoming's Bitcoin Research Institute. This is housed in the College of Arts and Science, an academic unit on campus that is dedicated to the study of Bitcoin, and only Bitcoin. We will not say good things about other crypto projects. We will not say bad things about other crypto projects. We'll not talk about blockchains or anything like that. We'll talk about Bitcoin. And the goal is to produce peer-reviewed, scholarly research that can be cited by journalists and lawmakers about Bitcoin from all of the academic disciplines that are relevant to Bitcoin. That includes philosophy, as
Good job.
that includes philosophy, computer science, economics, electrical engineering, petroleum engineering, climate science, and many, many more, right? Bitcoin is relevant to all of these different fields. And one of the geniuses of Bitcoin is the incentive structure, right? We all know this. This is one of the things that we find fascinating, that Satoshi seems to have made so many correct decisions about how to incentivize this. And so we realize that the incentive structure right now in academia is not to write positive things about Bitcoin. In fact, to write negative things about Bitcoin. And so we need to change some of the incentives. We theorize that there are a lot of Bitcoiners who are in academia that we don't know about because they have not yet been willing to step out and take the reputational risk of being in favor of Bitcoin or even being interested in Bitcoin. And so we feel that if we can reward them with community of people who are interested in talking about these issues, with potential collaborators and co-authors, with free trips to Laramie, Wyoming to hang out in the mountains with us, that they will come out of the woodwork and that the scholarly research on Bitcoin will get better. We've talked about how the scholarly research on Bitcoin that's bad has bled into bad journalism and bad policy, but how could the good scholarly work on Bitcoin make the same path, Craig?
Well, one way to do it is for us academics to do our own journalism, to write op-eds and such. Another way is to put our research directly in the hands of people who have direct connections to people who walk the halls of Congress and other branches of government around the world. So this is what, for example, Coin Center is doing in Washington, D.C., especially in defense of the Tornado Cash developers, which is really important. This is what Bitcoin Policy UK is doing, who we've heard from this week. They're doing important work. Maybe you can get them some tea and crumpets or something. And also, this is what we're doing with the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where David Zell and Grant McCarty are fundamentally altering the shape of Bitcoin policy in Washington, D.C. They're moving their headquarters to D.C. soon, and they've done really important work over the last few years. One thing that we've done over the last couple of years is organize the Bitcoin Policy Summit, where we've had something like 500 attendees, 75 government officials, 250 public policy officials, all in attendance, including representatives from places that many of you may not be fans of, places like the World Economic Forum, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. But this is a place where we can put our heads together and think about better policies for Bitcoin. Another thing that's housed within the Bitcoin Policy Institute is the PDP Rights Fund, run by a lawyer and fellow with the Bitcoin Policy Institute named Zach Shapiro. And donations to the PDP Rights Fund go directly to the defense of the Samurai Wallet developers. So anyway, this has all been fairly abstract. And Andrew, would you say more about the actual kind of research that we might be doing?
Beyond the book, we're already working on a number of projects. We'll break off just a little bit of that to give you a sample of the kinds of questions that we find interesting and that we're pursuing and that academics will also be working on. Here's a question that a lot of Bitcoiners have thought about deeply. We know Bitcoin's valuable, but why? What makes Bitcoin valuable? As it turns out, this is a deep question. And one way to see why it's difficult is to think about other digital items. Have you ever shared a spicy meme? Passed on something that was given to you? Yeah, it's just copy-paste. It's free. And this is the magic of turning something into information and using information technologies that information can be reproduced very, very cheap. Bitcoin is a digital item, whether it's the network, the code, the asset. It's a digital item. And yet, it can't exactly be reproduced for free. There's a lesson here. Now here's another feature of Bitcoin that brings into sharp relief the question why this matters here, which is that, like other digital items, Bitcoin is virtual. And when we say something is only a virtual reality, that's kind of like saying it's not a reality at all. And yet, Bitcoin is valuable. So we think that Bitcoin is a really important case to use when thinking about these broader questions of digital value, digital artifacts, whether they could be real or not, and whether, if real, they could have value. So this is a nice example about how we can reflect on Bitcoin to understand broader issues, and vice versa. If you want to read the results of this, the first paper on this project is already released. It's called Digital Value.
Bitcoin prompts us to question things that we've always taken to be true and to take a step back and try to see things more broadly. And so after the Bitcoin book, we are prompted to take a step back and think, what does a just monetary system look like? And the topic of justice has received a lot of attention in philosophy, going back to at least Plato. And so we can use some of the frameworks from this philosophical literature to try to understand money and see where Bitcoin fits into that kind of system. Two predominant families of theories about justice are pattern theories and historical theories. Pattern theories look at the spread of, in this case, let's say, economic goods, money, and determine whether that is just or unjust. Historical theories take a bit broader of a scope and look at how we got to the current pattern of distribution. But you can go a step higher and ask about the structures that bring about the historical trends and the current trends. And so it's worth thinking about how Bitcoin's structure, its governance, things like that, compare to the other monetary systems that are on offer. And in fact, if you look at some of the early social justice literature, you find people saying things that sound a lot like things that Bitcoiners say about what the monetary system should look like. Things like it should be opt-in, it shouldn't be coercive, it should return power to the people, it should involve personal freedom. And so My hypothesis is, and this is a paper that I'm working on, is that the ideal structures, the governing structures that early critical theorists and social justice are embodied very well by Bitcoin.
So in April 23, I was in the audience at Princeton University, where I was sitting next to Troy Cross, the Bitcoiner, and we were listening to Carol House give a talk. And I turned to Troy and said, "Is she saying what I think she's saying?" And he said, "Yeah, I think she is." And what she was saying was that the government has a couple strategies, potentially up its sleeves, for coercing Bitcoin miners domiciled in the United States to not put blacklisted transactions into their Bitcoin blocks. And she offered these two strategies, and it triggered me so much that I've teamed up with another Bitcoin policy fellow and economist, Josh Hendrickson, to write a paper in reply. It's called #handcuffs, and we're about to send it off to a journal. Another paper that I'm working on, which I'm also quite excited about, is about financial disclosures. That sounds boring, but let me pitch it to you. So we are Bitcoin holders, small amounts, of course. We're philosophers. But we have to disclose that because that's a potential source of bias. But when you academic articles on Bitcoin and op-eds and things from other people and from journalists, they don't disclose that they've missed out on Bitcoin. And they've missed out a lot, depending on how long they've been anti-Bitcoin. So take Paul Krugman, for example. He's been critical of Bitcoin for over 10 years. Imagine if he had to disclose on his next blog post that he's a salty economist and he's missed out on something like $5 million. So this is the kind of argument I'll be making in this paper called Sour Grapes Bias. So we've covered some research articles that we're working on currently. We also have a sequel to Resistance Money in the works, and so we're excited about that. But I was wondering at this point, Brad, if you would just take us home.
Yeah. We started with more et al. That was bad. And academia has been hostile to Bitcoin for a long time. The articles that were published early on were okay. And then as Bitcoin got more popular and more interesting, more people piled on, and the trend went distinctly negative. And we've seen a lot of negative articles that have not just been critical of Bitcoin, but have just missed basic facts about Bitcoin. And we've said a little bit about how we're trying to fix that problem a couple of different ways, through the Bitcoin Research Institute, the Bitcoin Policy Institute, our own work. But there's a lot more to do. We need more people involved. We need more researchers, more academics willing to take the risk, reputational and otherwise, of working on Bitcoin and publishing these papers, because we've seen how these academic papers affect public discourse about Bitcoin and how that ultimately filters up to policy, which affects all of us. So you can help by publicizing these things, by publicizing the work of academics who understand Bitcoin, by buying our book, I guess, and giving it out to people and saying, look, there's a university press thing on it. That means it's okay for you to read. It's been vetted by the academic community. But more than that, you can share the things that we do, and you can support the Bitcoin Policy Institute, the Bitcoin Research Institute. You can lend us your thoughts, your ideas, your arguments, your money, perhaps, your Bitcoin. We accept Bitcoin. Academia has worked against Bitcoin for a very long time, and it's time to get academia to start working for Bitcoin. Where'd the book go?